In this video we're going to look at some basics on percentages, but before we do that, let's look at the basics of fractions. Why? Because that's what percentages are. They're fractions. By the way, decimals are fractions as well, but we'll leave that for another video. So, fractions. What's a fraction? A fraction is anything that is part of a whole. Part of a whole. So if that circle is the whole, let's split that circle into 4. That's right, 4 equal parts, and we call these parts quarters, or, if you're an American, fourths. Now here's the first thing you need to know about fractions. The number of parts in the whole goes on the bottom of the fraction. So in this case we've got 4 parts, so we put the number 4 at the bottom. And that number is called the denominator. So the denominator tells us how many parts in total the whole is split into. So in this case we've got 4 parts, so the denominator is 4. If we're looking at one part, 1 out of the 4, then we write the 1 on top. And as you probably know, the top number in a fraction is called the numerator. So here we have the whole amount split into 4 quarters. 4 is the denominator. We're looking at 1 quarter, so the 1 becomes the numerator. And I hear you say, big whoopee do. Okay, so let's make this a little bit more impressive. Let's say the total here is worth $16. So that's the whole amount. And because we've split this into 4, that means each part, or each quarter, must be worth $4. And in this case, we're looking at 1 quarter. So 1 quarter of the 16 must be $4. That's how it works. But what if the question was, what's 3 quarters of 16? So in this case, we're looking at 3 parts of the 4, and clearly the answer there is going to be $12. That's how it works. Now if you're interested in the maths routines for these, 1 quarter of 16 can be written like this, and we cancel, but the number 4 goes into 4 once and goes into 16 4 times, so 1 times 4 is 4 as the numerator, 1 times 1 is 1, so that's going to be $4. Much easier in this case just to reason it through. And 3 quarters of 16, again we can cancel. 3 fours are 12, 1 times 1 is 1, but again in this situation much easier just to think it through. Now in your long life to date you may have noticed that there are a lot more types of fractions than quarters. So let's look at this situation. We have a pentagon, and let's divide the pentagon into 5. We'll pretend that they're equal. In this case, let's say that the pentagon represents $30. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about 5 parts, so we're talking about fifths. So the denominator will be 5. And what's this situation telling us? Well, if we're dividing the $30 into fifths, then each part must be 30 divided by 5 is $6 for each part. Now let's say that the question is, what is 3/5 of $30? Clearly that's pretty easy. 3 of these gives us $6, $12, $18. Any questions that are easy to think through are better off to think through. Some of them you'll need to work out on paper or with a calculator. But this one here is very straightforward. And just out of interest, 4/5 of 30 would be 18 plus 6 is 24. Again, if you want to see the mathematics routine for this, let's just do the first one. 3/5 of means times, 30, turn the 30 into a fraction, so it's 30 over 1. What cancels? 5 goes into both 30 and into 5, so that becomes a 6. 3 6s are 18, 1 on the bottom, 1 times 1 is 1, and that's again $18, the same as this over here. Okay, so now you're impressed, I can tell. But I thought we were going to talk about percentages. Well, we have been talking about percentages, but we've been using the language of fractions. So let's see what happens when we start using the language of percentages. So here's the only thing you need to know about percentages. Are you ready for this? This is big. Everything about percentages stems from this one big idea. Are you ready? The whole amount is 100%. That's it. That's all you really need to know. Everything else comes from there. The whole amount is 100%, which means that a half must be 50%, a quarter must be 25%, and a tenth is 10%, and so it goes on. Now let's look at the percent sign. Percent. What does per mean? Per means out of. What does cent mean? Cent, short for century. Any cricket fans out there? Century means 100. So cent is short for 100. So percent means out of 100, which makes sense because the whole is 100%. So if we're looking at 50%, that's 50 out of 100. Hang on, that's the same as a half, because this is a half of the whole. So 50 out of 100 is a half. And that's because 50 divides into 50 once and into 100 twice. So a half is the same as 50 out of 100, and that's the same as 50%. All stuff you probably know, but hopefully you're getting a better feel for how all this works. So let's look at the questions that we did a while ago. The first one was, what's a quarter of $16? Now, speaking in the language of percentages, what would this question be? Here's our quarter. So if the whole is 100%, well, actually we looked at this very briefly, didn't we? We popped down what a quarter was. A quarter is 25%. So another way of writing this, or another way of asking this question would be, what's 25% of $16? And if you know that 25% is a quarter, you can choose to work in fractions or percentages if you know what the conversions are. But in terms of a maths routine, you could work this out this way. I would prefer to start it with a quarter, but you could do it this way, 16, and then you would obviously simplify this down to 1 over 4, and the 4's cancel as well, and so that's going to be $4. But once again, because this is a simple situation, much easier to think it through and think, well, that's a quarter of 16. Quarter of 16 is 4. Now, another question that we had was, and we drew a pentagon for this one, but let's just use a circle. We were talking fifths in this question. The question was, what's 3/5 of $30? So the whole amount here was $30. And we worked out that each fifth must have been 6. Now, the same question asked in the language of percentages would be what? We're talking these 3/5. So what's 1/5 as a percentage? If each fifth is 20%, that'll be right. And 3 is 60. So another way of asking the same question would have been, what's 60% of $30? Now, if we're starting this question from scratch, I mean, we know what the answer is. We know it's $18. A really easy way of doing this is saying, well, what's 10%? Because 10% just means what's 1/10, and that's dividing by 10, which is very simple. If we want to find out what 60% of 30 is, well, let's look at what 10% is. 10% is 3. So 20% is 6. And 60% must be 6 lots of 3, and that's 18. So that's one of the easiest ways of working with percentages to get the same answer that we had before. Let's look at one final question. What's 15% of $40? We could, we could set this out as a fraction, 15 hundredths times by 40 over 1 blah, blah, blah. However, I wouldn't do it that way. I'd say, okay, let's look at this 15%. What's 15%? 15% is 10% plus half of 10%. Well, 10% is really easy to find. So 10% of 40 is 4. So 5% of $40 is 2. So 15% of $40 must be 4 plus 2 is $6. That's how easy questions can be when using percentages. So there you have it, the basics on percentages as well as the basics of fractions. So 4 things you have to know. Firstly, the number of parts that the whole is divided up into becomes the denominator. Secondly, the number of parts that we're looking at, let's say 3 parts out of 4, becomes the numerator. Thirdly, percent means out of 100. And finally, the whole is 100%. That's it. Everything else springs from those 4 bits of information. So have fun with percentages and with fractions.